The silence in the Choi Corporation's obsidian-tiled boardroom was louder than the gunshot that had just ended at 11:47. 6 lieutenants sat as if turned to stone, their breaths hitching as the seventh man, a traitor who had been begging for his life seconds ago, slumped onto the white marble table. Choi Sung-kyu didn't look at the body. He holstered his suppressed weapon with the same clinical indifference he used to check his watch. At 45, in a dark green silk suit that shimmered like a serpent's scales, he appeared less like a man and more like a statue of discipline and dread. His face was a mask of perfect stillness, the expression of a man who had long ago traded his pulse for power. "Burn the records," Sung-kyu said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, "and ensure his family thinks he moved to the countryside, double the usual silence bay." He didn't wait for a response. He walked out, his leather heels clicking rhythmically against the floor, leaving the cleanup to the men who feared him more than they feared the law. Sung-kyu moved through the corridors of his private compound, passing Goryeo-era Celadon vases and high-definition monitors that tracked the heartbeat of his 3-acre fortress. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a constant, vibrating reminder of the 47 missed calls from his father and the board. He ignored them. In his world, everyone waited for him. He stepped onto the expansive balcony overlooking the neon-soaked sprawl of Seoul. From this height, the city looked like a circuit board he could switch off at will. The Choi family didn't just own the skyline, they owned the shipping lanes, the political favors, and the shadows in between. They had ruled for 3 generations with a philosophy of perfection or death. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing the starburst birthmark on his forearm. The stain, his father told him, was a sign of his weakness. He had spent 24 years trying to drown the memory of Maya in the blood of his enemies, convincing himself he was a king. But as the wind whipped against his face, Choi Sung-kyu didn't feel like a king. He felt like a ghost haunting his own empire. He didn't know that across town, in a hotel lobby, an elderly woman in a cream dress was waiting to prove that the ghost had a daughter. The cool night air of the balcony couldn't touch the heat radiating from Sung-kyu's skin as he unbuttoned his cuff and pushed the silk sleeve of his dark green suit toward the elbow. There, etched into the pale skin of his inner forearm, was the jagged, 5-pointed mark. His father had called it a stain, a genetic deformity that proved the Choi blood was becoming diluted and weak. But in the quiet of his own mind, Sung-kyu remembered the only person who had ever looked at the mark with anything other than disgust: Maya. The memory of her was a sharp blade, kept polished by 2 decades of regret. She had been the daughter of a visiting diplomat, a woman who moved through the stiff, ritualistic world of the Seoul elite like a burst of color in a monochrome film. When she had first seen the mark during a stolen afternoon in the gardens of the Hanamdong estate, she hadn't recoiled. Instead, she had traced its edges with a warm thumb, whispering that it looked like a starburst, a sign that he was destined for a light far brighter than the shadows of his family's business. For one summer, 24 years ago, Sung-kyu had almost believed her. He had been 21, a prince of a dark kingdom who was ready to abdicate for a life he didn't have to hide. But the Choi Empire didn't allow for exits. When his father found out about the pregnancy, the machinery of the syndicate moved with terrifying speed. He remembered the smell of smoke and the clinical tone of his father's voice the night he was told the apartment in Atlanta had burned to the ground. "She's gone, Sung-kyu, the girl and the mistake she carried. Now, you will be the man this family needs you to be." He had been too young, too terrified of the man who shared his blood, to ask why there was no body to bury or why the investigation was closed within hours. He had accepted the lie because the alternative, fighting his father, meant a death he wasn't ready to face. So he had buried Maya in his heart and spent 24 years turning himself into the monster his father demanded. He had perfected the stillness, the casual violence, and the icy indifference that now defined his life. He looked back down at the birthmark. Under the harsh balcony lights, it looked less like a star and more like a scar. He thought he was the last of a dying breed, a man whose legacy would end with the very empire he had helped build. He had long ago accepted that his life was a closed loop of blood and business. But as he rolled his sleeve back down, hiding the starburst beneath the expensive silk, a strange, phantom ache throbbed in his arm, a pull toward a truth he wasn't yet aware was waiting for him in the lobby below. The Shilla Hotel lobby was a cathedral of glass and gold, a place where the air itself felt expensive and filtered. At 10:15 the following morning, the rhythmic strike of polished Oxfords against the limestone floor announced Choi Sung-kyu's arrival. He moved at the center of a phalanx of 6 men in identical black suits, a formation designed to repel anyone who dared approach. The entourage was a moving wall of muscle and menace, carving a path through the tourists and business moguls who instinctively stepped aside, sensing the violent gravity of the man in the dark green suit. Sung-kyu didn't look left or right. His eyes were fixed on the revolving doors, his mind already calculating the logistics of the afternoon's hostile takeover. But as they neared the grand piano in the center of the lounge, the formation faltered. A woman stood directly in their path. She was elderly, her skin the color of deep mahogany, framed by a halo of silver hair pulled back into a neat, dignified bun. She wore a simple cream-colored dress that looked out of place amidst the designer labels surrounding her, yet she possessed a stillness that rivaled Sung-kyu's own. She didn't flinch as the lead bodyguard moved to shoulder her aside. Instead, she raised a single, weathered hand. It was a small gesture, but it carried the authority of a queen. The lead guard stopped dead, confused by the lack of fear in her eyes. The entire entourage drifted to a halt, a sudden island of silence in the bustling lobby. Sung-kyu stepped forward, his brow furrowing. He looked down at the woman, his hand resting instinctively near his jacket's hem. "Move," he said, the word a low, dangerous vibration. Josephine Wright did not move. She looked up at the man who held the city in his grip, her expression one of somber recognition rather than terror. She didn't look at his suit or his guards. She looked directly at his right arm, hidden beneath the silk of his sleeve. "You have your father's eyes," she said, her voice steady and carrying a soft southern lilt that felt like an intrusion from another world. "But my granddaughter has your birthmark." The world tilted. The stillness Sung-kyu had spent decades perfecting shattered like cheap glass. Behind him, his men shifted in shock, their hands twitching toward their holsters, but Sung-kyu remained frozen. The starburst, the secret stain he had just been staring at on his balcony. This woman, a stranger from across an ocean, had just spoken the one truth that wasn't supposed to exist. "What did you say?" Sung-kyu hissed, the blood draining from his face. "The starburst, Mr. Choi," Josephine replied, her raised hand dropping slowly to her side. "The mark you think is a curse. It's on the arm of a girl in Mapogu who thinks her father died in a fire 24 years ago." The transition from the public grandeur of the Shilla lobby to the sterile, soundproofed confines of the hotel's private conference suite was a blur of adrenaline and disbelief. Sung-kyu's men stood like statues outside the heavy oak doors, their confusion masked by professional stoicism, leaving the Mafia boss alone with the woman who had just set his world on fire. Sung-kyu didn't sit. He stood by the window, his back to Josephine, watching his own reflection in the glass. "Explain yourself," he commanded, though the ice in his voice was beginning to crack. "Maya died in Atlanta. There was a fire. I have the reports." "Reports bought with the same ink used to sign checks," Josephine said softly. She sat at the long table, her hands folded over a worn leather envelope. "There was a fire, Mr. Choi, but the apartment was empty." Maya was already on a bus to Savannah, terrified and alone, with $50,000 in a paper bag and a promise that if she ever spoke your name again, she wouldn't live to see the child walk. Sung-kyu turned, his eyes narrowing. 50,000, my father deals in billions, he wouldn't. He didn't want to kill her, Josephine interrupted, her gaze steady. He wanted to erase her. He told her you were the one who signed the check. He told her you were the one who suggested the settlement to clean up your mess before you took over the company. She was 21, pregnant, and she loved you. That lie hurt her more than the threat of a bullet ever could. Josephine slid a yellowed, handwritten ledger and a bank slip across the polished wood. The date was 3 days after the reported fire. The signature on the authorization form was unmistakable, the sharp, arrogant calligraphy of Choi Deong, Sung Kyu-'s father. She spent that money on a life for her daughter, Josephine continued. She worked 3 jobs to keep Amara in school to keep her hidden, but Maya never stopped looking at the stars. She told Amara that her father was a man of light who lived in a kingdom of shadows. She died 5 years ago believing you were the one who sent her away. The air in the room felt thin. Sung Kyu looked at the bank slip, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. For 24 years, he had lived as a loyal soldier to a man who had murdered his soul with a forgery. The perfection of the Choi Empire was revealed as a hollow monument built on the ashes of his happiness. Where is she? Sung Kyu whispered, the ruthless boss replaced by a man haunted by a ghost. She's here in Seoul, Josephine replied. Searching for the truth her mother was too afraid to find. She has your mark, Sung Kyu, and now she has your enemies too. In a cramped 4th-floor walk-up in the shadow of Mapogu's industrial cranes, Amara sat hunched over a flickering laptop screen. The air in the tiny studio apartment smelled of instant coffee and the damp heat of a Seoul summer. On her screen, a legal document for a logistics firm waited to be translated from Korean to English, another 20-page slog that would barely cover her rent. To the world, she was just another foreign face in the city, a 23-year-old American girl trying to find her roots through freelance gigs and sheer willpower. She paused, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her dark, tired eyes. Her mother, Maya, had always spoken of Seoul with a mixture of reverence and terror, describing it as a city of beautiful lights and hidden daggers. Maya had died 5 years ago in a small house in Georgia, leaving Amara with nothing but a collection of old jazz records, a deep-seated curiosity about a father who supposedly died in a fire, and the mark. Amara rubbed her right forearm. Even through the thin cotton of her sweatshirt, she could feel the slight texture of it. She pulled back the sleeve, revealing the starburst birthmark. It was an intricate, jagged pattern of pigment that looked like a celestial explosion. As a child, she had called it her lucky star, but as she grew older, it felt more like a brand, a permanent link to a man she had never met and a history she couldn't escape. Her phone vibrated against the cluttered desk, a notification from a DNA ancestry site she had sent a kit to months ago. New match detected. Immediate family. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm. She had spent her life believing her father was a ghost, a tragic victim of a domestic accident. But the woman who had raised her, Josephine, had recently traveled to Korea with a look of grim determination that Amara didn't understand. Josephine had told her to stay in the apartment, to keep her head down, and to wait. Amara looked out the window at the distant, shimmering towers of the city's corporate district. Somewhere out there, among the glass and steel, lived the other half of her blood. She didn't know about the obsidian boardrooms or the silenced gunshots. She didn't know that the man of light her mother had described was currently standing in a hotel suite, realizing his entire life was a lie. She only knew that the birthmark on her arm was suddenly throbbing with a strange, magnetic pull, as if the city itself were finally starting to call her home. She reached for the phone, her fingers trembling, unaware that the quiet life of a translator was about to be swallowed by the shadow of an empire. The heavy oak door of the conference suite clicked shut, leaving Sung Kyu in a silence so profound it felt heavy. In his hand, the slip of paper with Amara's phone number felt like a live wire, pulsing with a current that threatened to undo 24 years of disciplined coldness. He stood by the window, his reflection ghostly against the backdrop of the Seoul skyline he had spent a lifetime conquering, and realized he was terrified. He had faced rival syndicates and stared down assassins without a flicker of doubt, but the prospect of a dial tone made his breath hitch. His thumb hovered over the screen. Josephine's words echoed in his mind. A girl who thinks her father died in a fire. With a sharp, jagged exhale, he pressed the icon and held the device to his ear. The ringing was rhythmic, clinical. 1, 2, 3. Hello. The voice was soft, colored by an American accent and a hint of exhaustion. It was a voice that sounded like a memory he hadn't known he possessed, a haunting resonance of Maya's melodic lilt. Sung Kyu opened his mouth, but the stillness failed him. The ruthless mafia boss was gone, replaced by a man whose throat had tightened into a knot of grief and wonder. "Hello," she repeated, a note of suspicion creeping in. "Who is this?" "It's." He stopped, swallowing hard. He cleared his throat, trying to find the gravelly authority that usually commanded rooms, but it came out as a fragile rasp. "My name is Choi Sung Kyu." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. A long, suffocating silence followed. Sung Kyu closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the cool glass of the window. "My grandmother told me you might call," she said finally, her voice trembling. She told me the truth about the fire, about everything." "Amara," he whispered, the name feeling like a prayer on his lips. He needed to know. He needed the one thing that would bridge the gap between a stranger's claim and the blood in his veins. "Josephine mentioned something, a mark, on your arm." His voice cracked on the last word, a sound of pure, unvarnished vulnerability that would have shocked his lieutenants. "The starburst," Amara replied, and he could almost hear her pulling back her sleeve. "It's on my right forearm, 5 points, like a jagged star. My mother told me it was a gift from a man who lived in the light." A single tear escaped Sung Kyu's eye, tracking a path down his stone-carved face. The physical confirmation was a blow to the chest, shattering the last of his defenses. The starburst wasn't a stain. It was a map that had finally led him back to the only part of himself that was still human. "I'm coming to see you," he said, his voice regaining a desperate, fierce strength. "Stay where you are. I'm coming home." The industrial cafe in Mapogu was a skeletal structure of exposed brick and rusted iron, a far cry from the gilded halls of the Shilla. Sung Kyu sat at a corner table, his dark green suit an alien splash of luxury against the grime of the district. He had sent his men to wait 2 blocks away, a gesture of vulnerability that felt more dangerous than any gunfight. When the door creaked open, he didn't need to look up to know she had arrived. The air in the room seemed to shift, pulled toward a gravity he hadn't felt in 24 years. Amara was smaller than he had imagined, her frame delicate but her posture rigid with a defiance that mirrored his own. She wore a faded denim jacket, her eyes, Maya's eyes, searching his face for a monster and finding only a man who looked like he had been hollowed out by a ghost. She sat across from him without a word, the silence between them heavy with the weight of 2 decades of stolen time. "You look like her," Sung Kyu whispered, his voice failing him. "The way you hold your shoulders, Maya used to do that when she was nervous." Amara didn't flinch. Instead, she reached out and unbuttoned the cuff of her jacket. "I don't want stories yet," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I need to see it. I need to know why my mother was so afraid of a mark." Sung Kyu nodded slowly. He unbuttoned the gold link of his right sleeve and rolled the silk back. He placed his forearm on the scarred wooden table, the starburst birthmark vivid against his pale skin. Amara hesitated for a heartbeat, then slowly laid her own arm beside his. The sight was a physical blow. The marks were not just similar, they were perfect mirrors, twin celestial explosions etched into their flesh by a quirk of blood and fate. The 5 jagged points of his mark aligned with the 5 points of hers, a biological signature that no forgery could replicate and no fire could erase. Amara's breath hitched. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches above his skin, tracing the air around the mark she had looked at every day of her life. For the first time, she saw it not as a lonely, lucky star, but as a bridge. "My father told me this was a stain," Sung Kyu said, his gaze fixed on their joined shadows. "He told me it was a sign that I was broken, but she saw it as a star. She was right." Amara looked up, her eyes swimming with tears that finally broke. "She died waiting for the light to come back, Mr. Choi. She died thinking you chose the empire over us." "I was a coward," he admitted, the truth finally surfacing in the dim light of the cafe. "But I am done being afraid of my father. You are not a stain, Amara. You are the only thing in this city that is real." In that moment, the industrial cafe felt like the center of the universe. The mafia boss and the translator sat in the wreckage of their shared history, their arms side by side, finally seeing the reflection of a truth that was about to go to war with the world. The clinical white envelope sat on the dashboard of Sung Kyu-'s car like a live explosive. He had spent his life dealing in certainties, market shares, body counts, and political leverage. But as he pulled the tab and extracted the heavy bond paper, his hands betrayed him with a tremor he couldn't suppress. The logo of the Seoul Forensic Institute stared back at him, cold and impartial. His eyes skipped past the technical jargon, the loci markers, and the complex probability chains, landing on the final, irrefutable number, 99.9997%. Probability of paternity, positive. Sung Kyu let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for 24 years. The starburst mark had been the soul's evidence, but this was the world's evidence. Amara wasn't just a possibility, she was a fact. She was the living, breathing proof that the most powerful man in his life, his father, was a liar who had built a kingdom on a foundation of stolen joy. He didn't call his father. He didn't call the board. Instead, he picked up his encrypted satellite phone and dialed a number that didn't exist on any corporate directory. "Kwan," Sung Kyu said as soon as the line clicked open. "I need the ghost unit, 4 men, the best you have, non-attributable deep cover." "Target, sir," the voice on the other end asked, professional and devoid of curiosity. "Not a target, a client," Sung Kyu corrected, his voice hardening into the steel of a man preparing for a siege. "A young woman in Mapogu, Amara, right. I want a perimeter established around her apartment, her workplace, and Josephine Wright's hotel. If a shadow moves toward them without my clearance, eliminate the shadow. Do not let her see you. Do not let my father's cleaners see you. To the world she must remain a ghost, but to you, she is the only thing that matters." "Understood, boss. She's covered." Sung Kyu ended the call and looked at the DNA report one last time before feeding it into the portable shredder in his center console. The science had confirmed what his heart already knew, but it had also officially started the clock. In the world of the Choi Syndicate, a secret this big was a death sentence once it reached the ears of the patriarch. He put the car into gear, the engine purring like a predatory animal. He had spent decades protecting a legacy he hated. Now, for the first time, he was using the machinery of the underworld to protect something he actually loved. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a father behind a shield, and he knew that the moment he stepped into his father's estate for Sunday dinner, the blood and science would finally collide. The dining room of the Choi estate was a vault of suffocating tradition, illuminated by a crystal chandelier that dripped like frozen tears over a table of ancient mahogany. At the head sat Choi Deong, 81 years old, his eyes as cold and sharp as the shards of a broken mirror. For decades, this Sunday ritual had been a silent reaffirmation of the patriarch's absolute control, a theater where the only sound was the clink of silver against porcelain. Sung Kyu sat opposite his father, his dark green suit a stark contrast to the elder's traditional black. He hadn't touched his food. The weight of the DNA report and the memory of the starburst mark on Amara's arm felt like a physical heat beneath his skin, a fire finally ready to breach the surface. "You've been distracted, Sung Kyu," Deong said, his voice a dry parchment rustle that still commanded the room. "The takeover in Mapogu is lagging. Perfection requires focus, not sentiment." Sung Kyu looked up, meeting his father's gaze with a stillness that felt different tonight. It wasn't the stillness of a soldier, it was the stillness of a judge. "I was in Mapogu," Sung Kyu said, his voice low and steady. "But I wasn't looking at real estate. I was looking at a ghost." The elder Choi didn't flinch, but his grip tightened on his wine glass. "Ghosts are for the weak. We burned those memories 24 years ago for your own sake." "You didn't burn a memory, father. You tried to burn a life." Sung Kyu reached into his jacket and pulled out a photo, not of a crime scene, but of a cafe table where 2 identical starburst marks lay side by side. He slid it across the mahogany. "The fire in Atlanta was a lie. The payoff was a lie. And the daughter I was told never existed is currently being watched by my best men." The silence that followed was absolute. Deong glanced at the photo, his lip curling in a sneer of pure aristocratic disdain. "A half-blood girl from the West is not a legacy. She is a liability, a stain on the Choi name. You will deal with this mistake quietly or I will. Sung Kyu stood up, the chair screeching against the marble floor like a declaration of war. He leaned over the table, his shadow looming large over his father. She is not a mistake. She is my heir, and I am finished with your perfection. You would throw away an empire for a girl you met yesterday, Diang hissed, his face reddening. I'm not throwing it away, Sung Kyu replied, his voice cracking the silence of the room like a gunshot. I'm taking it. From this moment on, the Choi Corporation serves my family, the real one. If you or any of your cleaners so much as look toward Mapogu, I will dismantle everything you spent 80 years building until there isn't a single stone left standing. He turned and walked toward the door, leaving the patriarch fuming in the shadows of his own hollow kingdom. For 24 years, Sung Kyu had been the prince of a dark empire. Tonight, he left as a father, and the war for his daughter's future had finally begun. The night air outside the ancestral estate was cold, but for the first time in his life, Choi Sung Kyu did not feel the chill. As he walked toward his waiting car, the obsidian and gold of his family's legacy felt like a skin he had finally shed. He climbed into the backseat, the engine purring like a tamed beast, and looked at his reflection in the tinted window. The man staring back was no longer a ghost haunting a corporate machine. He was a man with a destination. He drove back to Mapogu, but this time, he didn't stop at the industrial cafe. He pulled up to the curb of the modest brick walk-up where Amara lived. His ghost unit was already in place, invisible shadows in the night, a shield of steel that he had forged from the very underworld he now intended to dismantle. He realized then that his power, which for decades had been a blunt instrument of destruction and fear, had found a new, singular purpose. It was no longer about expanding an empire. It was about ensuring that one girl in a fourth-floor apartment could sleep without fear. When he reached her door, he didn't knock with the heavy authority of a boss. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the wood before tapping softly. Amara opened it, her eyes red from crying but her expression steady. Behind her, Josephine sat at the small kitchen table, a silent sentinel of the truth. I told him, Sung Kyu said, the words feeling like a weight lifting from his chest. I told him the empire is over if he touches you. I'm not going back, Amara, not to that version of myself. Amara looked at him, searching his face, and then her gaze dropped to his right arm where the starburst mark was hidden beneath his sleeve. It's going to be a war, isn't it? She asked quietly. Yes, Sung Kyu replied, stepping into the small, warm light of her home. But for the first time in 24 years, I know exactly what I'm fighting for. He sat down at the table, and as they began to talk, not of syndicates or payoffs, but of Maya, of Georgia, and of the years they had lost, the silence in the room felt different. It wasn't the suffocating silence of the Choi boardroom. It was the quiet, tentative beginning of a new history. Sung Kyu realized that love hadn't just found its way home. It had given him a home he never thought he deserved. The starburst mark wasn't a stain or a curse. It was a promise that even in the deepest shadows of an empire, a little bit of light could still find its way through. He was no longer the king of Seoul. He was just a father, and that was finally enough.